Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, by Richard P. Rumelt. Introduction. It's 1805. Off the coast of Spain, a battle is brewing that will decide the fate of Europe. Napoleon, the master of the continent, has his eyes set on his final prize, England. But to cross the Channel, he must first defeat the legendary British Royal Navy. His combined French and Spanish fleet is a terrifying sight, 33 massive ships of the line. Waiting for them is a smaller British fleet of only 27 ships, led by a man named Admiral Lord Nelson. Now, the established way to fight a naval battle back then was a gentlemanly, almost polite affair. The two fleets would form long, parallel lines and sail past each other, firing broadside after broadside. It was a contest of numbers and endurance. And on this day, Nelson was outnumbered. But Nelson wasn't interested in a fair fight. He had a different idea. A strategy. Instead of forming a parallel line, he did something shocking. He broke his fleet into two columns and drove them like spears, straight at the enemy's line, hitting them perpendicularly. It was an incredibly risky move. The lead British ships would have to endure the full, concentrated fire of the enemy without being able to fire back. But Nelson had a crucial insight. He judged that the less trained French and Spanish gunners wouldn't be able to aim properly in the heavy ocean swell that day. He was betting on a hidden weakness. His goal wasn't just to trade cannonballs, it was to shatter the enemy's coherence. To break their line, turn the orderly battle into a chaotic melee, and trust that in the confusion, his more experienced captains would triumph in a series of smaller, ship-to-ship duels. And he was right. At the end of the Battle of Trafalgar, the French and Spanish had lost 22 ships. The British lost none. Nelson himself was mortally wounded, but his strategy had saved England and secured British naval dominance for the next 150 years. That, right there, is the essence of good strategy. It's not a long, complicated plan. It's not a fluffy mission statement or a set of ambitious goals. It is a clear, coherent response to a critical challenge, one that leverages a key insight to multiply its power. And yet, most of what passes for strategy in our world today looks nothing like this. In the world of business, government, and even our own personal lives, we are drowning in what the legendary strategist Richard Rumelt calls bad strategy. In his landmark book, Good Strategy / Bad Strategy, Rumelt acts as our guide, a wise mentor who cuts through the fog of corporate buzzwords and motivational fluff to reveal a stunningly simple truth. Good strategy is rare, powerful, and often unexpected. And bad strategy is not just the absence of good strategy, it's a disease of its own, with clear symptoms we can all learn to recognize. By the end of our time together today, you'll have a new lens through which to see the world. You'll be able to spot bad strategy, the empty slogans, the wishful thinking, the laundry lists of goals, from a mile away, whether it's in a company's annual report, a politician's speech, or even your own plans for the future. And more importantly, you'll understand the simple, powerful core of what makes a good strategy actually work. This isn't just about business, it's about learning how to think with clarity and power. Book summary. Have you ever sat in a meeting where someone presented the company's grand new strategy, and it was nothing more than a list of buzzwords and high-sounding goals? Maybe it was something like our strategy is to be the global leader through synergistic growth and customer-centric innovation. And everyone nods along. But deep down, you're thinking, what does that actually mean? What are we supposed to do? If you've ever felt that, you've witnessed firsthand the epidemic that Richard Rumelt dedicated his life to diagnosing, the plague of bad strategy. Rumelt argues that we've become so accustomed to strategy as mere exhortation that we don't even blink anymore. A leader spouts some slogans, announces ambitious goals, maybe releases some balloons at a company retreat, and calls it a strategy, but it's not. It's an empty suit. And this isn't a harmless mistake. Bad strategy is incredibly destructive. It wastes energy, creates confusion, and actively prevents real progress. To fight it, Rumelt says, we first need to learn to recognize it. He gives us 4 clear hallmarks, 4 telltale signs that what you're looking at is bad strategy. The first, and most common, hallmark is fluff. Fluff is gibberish that masquerades as strategic thinking. It uses inflated, unnecessarily complicated words to create the illusion of high-level intellect. Rumelt gives the perfect example from a major retail bank whose strategy document declared, "Our fundamental strategy is one of customer-centric intermediation." Let's break that down. Intermediation is just a fancy word for what a bank does. It takes deposits and lends them out. And customer-centric is a buzzword that supposedly means focusing on the customer, but the bank had no specific policies that made it any more customer-focused than its competitors. So, if you pull off the fluffy wrapping paper, the statement actually says, "Our bank's fundamental strategy is to be a bank." It's a perfectly circular, utterly useless statement. It provides no guidance. It defines no action. It is pure fluff. And once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. The second hallmark of bad strategy is the failure to face the challenge. A strategy is a way of dealing with a challenge, an obstacle, a problem. If you haven't clearly identified the challenge, you can't possibly have a good strategy. You just have a wish list. Rumelt tells the story of International Harvester, once a giant American corporation. In 1979, they produced a thick corporate strategic plan with beautiful hockey stick graphs projecting massive growth in revenue and profit. The plan was detailed, covering every division. It talked about increasing market share and cutting costs. But the plan completely ignored the elephant in the elevator. Harvester had the worst labor relations in American industry. Its work rules were so inefficient that its profit margin was half that of its competitors. The plan didn't mention this. It didn't diagnose the central problem. And so, the company collapsed. After a disastrous 6-month strike, it lost billions, closed most of its plants, and laid off 85,000 workers. The strategic plan was worthless because it failed to confront the single biggest obstacle holding the company back. If you don't define the challenge, you can't conquer it. This leads us directly to the third hallmark, mistaking goals for strategy. This is perhaps the most common trap of all. A leader announces a big, audacious goal and believes they have created a strategy. But they haven't. Think of a football coach telling his team, "Our strategy is to win." That's not a strategy, that's the goal. The strategy is how you're going to win. Are you going to use a relentless running game to wear down their defense? Or a fast-paced no-huddle offense to keep them off balance? That's strategy. Rumelt shares the story of a CEO he calls Chad Logan, who proudly presented his company's 2020 plan. The goal was to achieve 20% revenue growth and a 20% profit margin. When Rumelt asked him how he planned to achieve this, the CEO's answer was all about motivation. He quoted Jack Welch about reaching for the impossible and talked about the will to win and pushing until we get there. This talk of one last push reminded Rumelt of the tragic generals of World War I, who flung hundreds of thousands of highly motivated young men directly into fortified machine gun emplacements at battles like Passchendaele. Those soldiers didn't lack motivation. They lacked competent strategic leadership. Motivation is vital. But it is not a substitute for a strategy. Your job as a leader, or even just as a person trying to achieve something difficult, is not just to want it badly. It's to create the conditions that make the effort effective. Setting a goal is not a strategy. A strategy is the path you forge to reach that goal. The final hallmark of bad strategy is having bad strategic objectives. A strategic objective isn't the final goal, it's an intermediate step, a key milestone on the way. But these objectives can be bad in 2 ways. First, you can have a dog's dinner of objectives, a messy, incoherent list of everything everyone wants to do. Rumelt mentions a small city whose strategic plan contained 47 strategies and 178 action items. Action item number 122 was create a strategic plan. It's a joke, but it's a common one. A long list isn't a strategy, It's a sign that leadership has failed to make the hard choices about what's truly important. The second type of bad objective is the blue sky objective. This is a goal that's so far-fetched, so disconnected from reality, that it's basically just a restatement of the desired state of affairs. Rumelt points to the Los Angeles Unified School District's plan to build transformational leaders in its weakest schools. This sounds wonderful, but there was no realistic plan for how to achieve it, especially when those schools were trapped in a massive, controlling bureaucracy. A good strategy builds a bridge from where you are to where you want to go. A blue sky objective just points at the destination and pretends the canyon in between doesn't exist. So, if bad strategy is so common and so easy to spot, why on earth is there so much of it? Rumelt suggests a few powerful reasons. The biggest one is the simple, painful unwillingness to choose. Strategy is about focus. And focus means choosing what not to do. It means setting aside some goals, some interests, some people's pet projects, in favor of others. This is hard. It's politically difficult and emotionally draining. Rumelt tells the story of being in a strategy meeting at the Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, in the early 90s. The company was in a death spiral, losing ground to the new personal computers. The executives were split. One group wanted to stick to what they knew, building integrated computer systems, the box's strategy. Another group believed the future was in customer service, the solutions strategy. And a third group argued that the only thing that mattered was semiconductor technology, the chip strategy. They couldn't agree. Each path required a massive, risky transformation. Instead of making a hard choice, they compromised. They wrote a fluffy, meaningless mission statement that said something like DEC is committed to providing high-quality products and services. It was a political outcome that offended no one and helped no one. They avoided the choice, and a few years later, the company was gone, acquired by a competitor. Universal buy-in often means that no real choice has been made. Another reason for bad strategy is the siren song of template-style strategy. You've seen this. It's the fill-in-the-blanks approach. Our vision is underscore. Our mission is underscore. Our values are underscore. This has become a huge industry for consultants because it's easy and it feels like you're doing something strategic. But it almost always produces generic, useless statements. Cornell University's mission, for example, is to educate leaders and extend knowledge. In other words, its mission is to be a university. This provides absolutely no guidance. It's charisma in a can, a bureaucratic attempt to replicate the magic of real vision without doing the hard work of actual strategy. So, after all this, what does good strategy actually look like? If bad strategy is a complex disease, good strategy is shockingly simple in its structure. Rumelt says that every good strategy has a basic, underlying logic he calls the kernel. And this kernel has three parts: a diagnosis, a guiding policy, and coherent action. It all starts with the diagnosis. A good diagnosis simplifies the overwhelming complexity of reality and defines the nature of the challenge. It answers the fundamental question, what's going on here? It's not a goal. It's a judgment about the critical factors in a situation. Think about Starbucks in 2008 when its growth stalled. One executive might diagnose the problem as market saturation. Another might see it as an eroding competitive advantage as competitors like McDonald's improve their coffee. A third might diagnose it as a failure to manage Wall Street's expectations. None of these are provably correct, but each diagnosis points in a very different direction. The diagnosis you choose frames the entire problem. Once you have a diagnosis, you need a guiding policy. The guiding policy is your overall approach for dealing with the challenge you've just diagnosed. It's not a list of detailed steps. It's like a signpost that marks the general direction forward. It rules out a vast array of other possible actions. When Lou Gerstner took over a failing IBM in 1993, the prevailing diagnosis was that the company was too integrated and needed to be broken up to match the newly fragmented computer industry. But Gerstner came up with a different diagnosis. He believed that in a world of fragmented parts, IBM's unique ability to understand all the pieces was a massive strength, not a weakness. So his guiding policy became, leverage IBM's broad expertise to offer customers tailored solutions to their information problems. He shifted the company's focus from selling hardware to providing IT consulting. This guiding policy didn't specify every action, but it set a clear, powerful direction. Finally, the kernel requires coherent action. This is where the strategy hits the ground. These are the feasible, coordinated steps, policies, and resource commitments designed to carry out the guiding policy. The key word here is coherent. The actions must work together, reinforcing each other to create a punch. Rumelt points to Ford in the late 90s as an example of incoherent action. CEO Jacques Nasser had a guiding policy of building a portfolio of premium brands, so he bought Volvo, Jaguar, and Land Rover. But at the same time, the company's old policy of economies of scale was still in force, so they took action to put Jaguar and Volvo on a common platform to save money. This was a disaster. Volvo buyers don't want a safe Jaguar, and Jaguar buyers don't want a sporty Volvo. The actions were in direct conflict, diluting the very brands they had paid billions to acquire. For a simple, positive example, Rumelt tells the story of his friend Stephanie, who owns a corner grocery store. She's facing hundreds of choices. Should she lower prices, stock organic produce, stay open later? It's overwhelming. Her diagnosis: the core challenge is competing with the giant 24/7 supermarket down the street. Her guiding policy: instead of trying to beat them on price, she'll focus on serving the busy professional who has little time to cook. Her coherent actions: she adds a second checkout stand to handle the 5 p.m. rush. She starts stocking high-quality, pre-made meals. And she decides she doesn't need to stay open until midnight, because her target customers aren't shopping then. Each action supports the others, creating a focused, coherent strategy that gives her a real advantage in her chosen niche. That's the kernel. Diagnosis, guiding policy, coherent action. It's the fundamental logic of every good strategy, from a corner store to a global corporation. So, you understand the basic structure of a good strategy. But where does its real power come from? How do you create that knockout punch that Nelson delivered at Trafalgar or that Steve Jobs used to save Apple? Rumelt says it comes from finding and using what he calls sources of power. One of the most fundamental sources is leverage. Leverage is about focusing your energy on a pivotal point where a small push will create a cascade of favorable outcomes. It's about finding the keystone in the arch. Rumelt says this comes from a mixture of anticipation, insight, and concentration. For instance, anticipation. While American car companies were all in on SUVs in the 90s, Toyota was investing over $1 billion in developing hybrid technology. Why? They anticipated that, eventually, fuel economy pressures would become a massive force in the market. They were skating to where the puck was going to be. Then there are pivot points, a natural imbalance in a situation you can exploit. In Japan, 7-Eleven's leadership noticed that Japanese consumers are obsessed with newness and variety. So they built their entire strategy around this insight. They created a system of quick response teams that work with small food manufacturers to rapidly bring new, private label snacks and meals to market, constantly refreshing their offerings. They found a pivot point in consumer psychology and built a whole machine to press on it. Another incredibly powerful idea Rumelt gives us is the proximate objective. A leader's most important job, he argues, is to absorb the massive complexity and ambiguity of a situation and hand the organization a simpler problem, a problem it can actually solve. That solvable problem is the proximate objective. It's a target that's close enough at hand to be feasible. The most famous example is President Kennedy's 1961 call to put a man on the moon. We often remember this as a bold, almost impossible dream. But Rumelt reveals it was a brilliant and carefully chosen proximate objective. At the time, the US was losing the space race. The Soviets had a big lead in heavy lift rockets. They could win a race to build a space station or put an unmanned vehicle on the moon. But Kennedy's top scientist, Wernher von Braun, gave him a crucial piece of advice. A moon landing would require a whole new generation of much, much larger rockets that neither side possessed. In a race that started from scratch, America's larger economy and resource base would be a decisive advantage. So, the moon landing wasn't a distant dream. It was the one race they had an excellent chance of winning. It was a feasible, strategic, and proximate objective that focused the nation's energy for a decade. For a more down-to-earth example, Rumelt tells a story from his time as a young engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, working on the Surveyor unmanned moonlander. The engineers were stuck. No one knew what the moon's surface was like. Was it soft powder? Sharp crystals? A jumble of boulders? You can't design a landing craft if you don't know what you're landing on. The project was deadlocked until a manager named Phyllis Bawalda did something brilliant. She wrote a specification that defined the lunar surface as being hard, grainy, with gentle slopes and scattered small rocks, basically, like the southwestern desert. Did she know this was true? No, nobody did. But as she explained, the engineers couldn't work without a specification. And if the moon turned out to be much more difficult than that, the whole program of landing a man there was in trouble anyway. Her specification wasn't the truth, it was a proximate objective. It absorbed the crippling ambiguity of the situation and gave the engineers a problem they knew how to solve. And they did. Surveyor successfully landed on a surface that, it turned out, looked a lot like Phyllis's desert. A third source of power is understanding chain-link systems. A system has a chain-link logic when its overall performance is limited by its weakest link. The Space Shuttle Challenger is a tragic example. Its weakest link was a simple rubber O-ring that failed in the cold. It didn't matter how advanced the guidance systems were or how strong the booster engines were. In a chain, you are only as strong as your weakest link, and strengthening the other links doesn't make the chain any stronger. This logic explains why so many organizations get stuck. Think of General Motors in its decline. Improving the quality of the transmission did little good if the knobs were still falling off the dashboard. A department manager in charge of transmissions has little incentive to spend millions on improvements if the design department is still producing bland cars and the fit and finish department is still sloppy. The system gets stuck in a state of low performance because improving just one link doesn't pay off. But here's the fascinating flip side. This same logic also explains sustained excellence. Think about IKEA. Its success is a tightly integrated chain of policies. It has giant suburban stores with lots of parking. It uses catalogs instead of a sales force. It designs its own ready-to-assemble, flat-pack furniture, and it has customers pull the items from the warehouse and take them home themselves. A competitor can't just copy one piece of this. A traditional furniture store that starts selling flat-pack furniture won't magically become IKEA. They'd still have the wrong store locations, the wrong cost structure, and no in-house design capability. To compete, a rival has to replicate the entire chain-linked system, which is incredibly difficult and expensive. IKEA's excellence is protected because its strategy is a coherent, chain-linked whole. Perhaps the most classic source of power is using advantage. A good strategy brings a relative strength to bear against a relative weakness. The story of David and Goliath isn't just a tale of courage, it's a masterclass in strategy. Goliath's apparent strengths, his immense size, heavy armor, and massive spear, were designed for close-quarters combat. But David refused to fight that fight. By choosing a shepherd's sling as his weapon, he redefined the battlefield. Suddenly, Goliath's armor was a weakness. It was heavy, slowing him down, and didn't cover the one vulnerable spot on his forehead. David's weapon delivered precise force over a distance, completely neutralizing Goliath's supposed advantages. The story teaches us that advantage isn't absolute. It's about seeing a situation from a new perspective that reveals a decisive asymmetry. This is exactly what Sam Walton did with Walmart. In the early days, The conventional wisdom in retail was that a big discount store needed a population of at least 100,000 people to support it. Walton seemed to break this rule by putting big stores in small towns. But Rumelt shows us that Walton didn't break the rule. He changed the game by redefining what a store was. For competitors like Kmart, the basic unit of management was the individual store. For Walton, the basic unit was the network. A regional distribution center serving 150 stores, all connected by a sophisticated computerized logistics system. That network of 150 stores served a population of millions. Walton's insight was to see retailing not as a collection of individual stores, but as an integrated logistical system. This was the hidden source of power that Kmart, stuck in its old way of thinking, could never replicate. Finally, some of the most powerful strategies of all don't come from creating an advantage, but from riding a wave of change. Important waves of change, shifts in technology, regulation, or customer tastes, are like earthquakes. They create new high ground and level old high ground. A brilliant strategist sees the wave forming, understands where it's heading, and channels their resources to occupy the positions that will become valuable and defensible as the new landscape takes shape. The story of Cisco Systems is a perfect example. In the 80s and early 90s, the computer and telecommunications industries were dominated by giants like IBM and Atant, whose power came from massive scale and billion-dollar development projects. Then, a series of waves began to hit. First, there was the rise of the microprocessor, which meant that a product's performance was increasingly determined not by custom hardware, but by clever software written by small, agile teams. Second, corporations were starting to build internal data networks to connect their different computers. And third, a free, vendor-neutral standard called IP Internet Protocol was gaining traction. Cisco, a tiny startup, didn't create these waves. But its leaders saw them and rode them perfectly. While the giants like IBM were stuck defending their own proprietary network protocols, Cisco built its routers to handle everyone's protocols, with a special focus on the rising IP standard. Then, the fourth and biggest wave hit, the explosion of the public internet in the mid-90s. Suddenly, every corporation needed to connect to the internet. IP became the dominant standard, and Cisco was perfectly positioned with the right product at the right time. They harnessed the power of these massive external changes and rode them all the way to the top. So how do you develop this kind of strategic mind? How do you learn to see the world like Rumelt, Nelson, or Steve Jobs? Rumelt's final and most profound lesson is that you must learn to think about your own thinking. The first step is to understand that strategy is a hypothesis. When Rumelt was working with a group of brilliant engineers at Hughes Electronics, they became frustrated. They were used to a world of certainty, of calculations and meticulous planning. This strategy stuff seemed vague and unscientific. Rumelt responded with a powerful analogy. He said a good strategy is like a good scientific hypothesis. A scientist doesn't deduce a new theory from what's already known. They make an inductive leap, an educated guess about how things work at the edge of knowledge. Then, they test that hypothesis with an experiment. A strategy is the same. It is your best educated guess about what will work in a complex and uncertain situation. Its implementation is the experiment. And as the results come in, you learn, you adapt, and you refine your hypothesis. Howard Schultz at Starbucks is the perfect example. His initial hypothesis was that he could perfectly replicate an Italian espresso bar in America. The experiment, his first store, showed that the hypothesis was flawed. Americans didn't want to stand at a bar and listen to opera. They wanted comfortable chairs, non-fat milk in their lattes, and big paper cups to go. Schultz was a great strategist not because his first idea was perfect, but because he paid close attention to the results of his experiment and continuously adjusted his strategy based on what he learned. The final challenge, and perhaps the greatest, is learning to keep your head when everyone around you is losing theirs. Good strategy requires independent judgment, but the pull of the crowd, of social herding, is incredibly powerful. Rumelt uses the spectacular rise and fall of Global Crossing to illustrate this danger. In the late 90s, the company was building a private fiber optic cable across the Atlantic, and the stock market was ecstatic. The narrative was all about the explosive growth of the internet. Traffic was doubling every year, and there would be an agonizing choke point for undersea capacity. Global Crossing stock soared, making it worth more than the Ford Motor Company. But Rumelt and his MBA students did a simple, fundamental industry analysis, the kind of thing taught in the first week of any strategy course. And what they saw was a nightmare. Transatlantic cable capacity was a perfect commodity. The technology wasn't proprietary. New competitors were rushing in. And technological advances meant the cost of adding capacity was plummeting. A massive oversupply and a price collapse were virtually inevitable. It was one of the worst possible industry structures imaginable. Yet when a student pointed out that the stock market was saying the exact opposite, everyone nodded. The market had spoken. The experts, the analysts, the consultants, they were all caught up in the hype, abandoning their own independent judgment to the wisdom of the crowd. And, of course, the crash came. Capacity exploded, prices collapsed, and Global Crossing went bankrupt. The fundamental analysis was right. The market was wrong. The lesson is timeless. A strategist must have the courage to trust their own analysis of the fundamentals, especially when the crowd is chanting the opposite. Commentary. When you finish a book like Good Strategy/Bad Strategy, you feel like you've been given a new pair of glasses. The world, which once seemed blurry and complex, suddenly snaps into focus. Richard Rumelt's most powerful gift isn't a complicated framework or a secret formula. It's the profound and liberating clarity of the kernel. This idea, that a real strategy is simply a diagnosis, a guiding policy, and coherent action, cuts through decades of corporate jargon and motivational fluff. It's a tool for thinking. It tells us that strategy isn't about creating a perfect, 100-page plan. It isn't about having a grand, poetic vision statement. It's about honesty. It's about being brutally honest in your diagnosis of the real challenge you face. It's about courage, the courage to make hard choices and adopt a guiding policy that focuses your energy. And it's about craftsmanship, the discipline to design coherent actions that all pull in the same direction. In a world that rewards quick answers, wishful thinking, and following the herd, this kind of clear, logical thinking is a superpower. And what's truly beautiful about it is that it applies to everything, not just billion-dollar corporations. Think about your own life, right now. Maybe you're a student feeling overwhelmed, an athlete trying to make the team, or an artist struggling to finish a project. You can apply the kernel today. What is the single biggest challenge holding you back? Don't list 10 things. Find the one critical obstacle. That's your diagnosis. What is your overall approach to overcoming it? Not a list of tasks, but a guiding principle. I will focus on consistency over intensity, or I will master the fundamentals before moving on to advanced techniques. That's your guiding policy. Finally, what are 2 or 3 specific, coordinated actions that will bring that policy to life? Not a random to-do list, but a set of actions that support and reinforce one another. Those are your coherent actions. This simple exercise can transform a vague feeling of being stuck into a clear path forward. It replaces anxiety with agency. That's why this book is so important. It reminds us that strategy is not the domain of high-priced consultants or CEOs in corner offices. It is a fundamental human skill. It is the art of identifying a challenge and creating a coherent way to overcome it. Good strategy is rare, which is precisely why it is so powerful. And by learning to see the difference between the real thing and the imitation, you're already halfway to mastering it. That was the core of Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt. We've explored the battlefields of Trafalgar, walked the halls of Apple with Steve Jobs, and seen how a simple corner store can outsmart a supermarket. But this is just the map. The real treasure is in the book itself. If any of these stories sparked something in you, if you felt that jolt of clarity, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning strategy, it's about learning how to think with more power and purpose. The link is in the description. Also, if this journey gave you a new perspective today, do me a small favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It tells me we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another world-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Thank you for listening, and let's keep learning together.